Hi, everyone. I'm going to wait just maybe one more minute or so and let people continue to file in. But welcome to this Zoom space. Okay. No, people are still filing in. Okay, I'm gonna get started just so you don't have to look at me in silence. Welcome everyone to this Montana Book Festival event. It is an MBF Plus event, an off-season event, and it is in partnership with Fact and Fiction Books here in Missoula, Montana. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. I do have a little housekeeping for everyone before I turn it over to our authors tonight. If you're interested in purchasing a copy or copies of Kerri's book, Milltown, what we're talking about tonight, I urge you to purchase them from our festival partner, Fact and Fiction, who has agreed to donate 10% of all book sales of festival titles like Milltown to the festival. So go to factandfictionbooks.com and be sure to enter MBF at checkout, and 10% of your purchase will come back to us so that we can continue programming like this. Feel free to submit any questions you will eventually have for Kerri, Chris, and or Leif via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Here on the back end of things, I'll be monitoring the chat if you're throwing questions out there, but do try to relegate your questions to the Q&A and just kind of conversation to the chat function. I'll be throwing out some links in there too, and you guys can, feel free to chat while the authors are having their conversation. And with that, I'm going to introduce you to our authors who you are here for tonight. So I'm going to introduce Kerri, Chris, and Leif. Leif Fredrickson, teaches public history and the history of the American West at the University of Montana. His academic research has been funded by Harvard University's Institute for New Economic Thinking, and his recent dissertation received awards from the Council of Graduate Schools and the Urban History Association. He created and runs the digital public history website EnviroHistory. He has also written for the Washington Post, The Guardian, The Conversation, and The Hill. He is currently writing a book about the history of lead poisoning in America. Poisoning, I didn't really enunciate that. Lead poisoning in America. And many of you will know him as one of the producers of the Death in the West podcast. Chris Latreille resides near Missoula, Montana, and is a writer of Chippewa Cree Métis descent and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. His first book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, won the 2018 Montana Book Award and the 2019 High Plains Book Award. His next book, Becoming Little Shell, much anticipated, will be published by Milkweed Editions in 2022. And Kerri Arsenault is a book critic, book editor at Orion Magazine, and a contributing editor at LitHub. She is also a mentor for PEN America's Prison and Justice Writing Program. Her work has appeared in Freeman's, the Boston Globe, Down East, the Paris Review Daily, the New York Review of Books, and Airmail. Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains, is her first book, and it's an amazing book. Kerri received an MFA from the New School and studied in the Master Program in Communication for Development at Malmö. Am I pronouncing that right? Malmö in University in Sweden. So welcome, Leif, Chris, and Kerri.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That umlaut on the O is hard to say. Malmö, I don't even know. Somebody can pronounce it better than me. But, hi, guys.
Hey, so I am going to kind of, whatever you call it, moderate this thing, I guess. But Kerri, we've been talking about doing something for your book since before it even came out, like in galley form.
Yep.
From when I first heard about it, because, Leif and I are both Missoula guys growing up here. And, while the impact was certainly smaller, there was a time when Missoula was certainly a mill town. we were certain, there were multiple mills on the other end of the valley, but certainly kind of that extraction-based economy that at one point would have been devastating if it all collapsed at the same time. So that's kind of, to me, what is interesting about this conversation is, the mill where my dad worked for 43 years is right outside of my window. I can look out and see what remains of it, and just kind of the legacy of it, both as employer and the lives that were created and changed when it shut down, as well as the lasting legacy environmentally of the impact that it has left in the valley and the river and everything about it. But before we go too deep into that, you want to do maybe like 5 minutes of just kind of what your book is about?
I can do even less than that. But I will, let's see, what can I say? For those who haven't read it, it's a little bit what you just said, and what I would repeat is, it's about this small town where I grew up. 3 generations of my family worked about a paper mill. In 1901, it opened in Maine, but sort of underneath that story is really about how humans are treated like waste, and working class jobs, and the dangerous environmental legacies that they leave behind in the course of their work. Thus, what remains, what you just said too, which is the subtitle of the book. 3 generations of my family made paper that was bleached pristine white, and in what we threw away in that bleaching process were byproducts so sinister and toxic that they made everybody so ill that our town was nicknamed Cancer Valley. But it's not just the toxics that cause so much grief, I would say, although I just found this statistic out, which I thought was terrifying, which the waste that we process, like household waste and everything, 97% of it is toxic. But anyway, once mill workers were used up they became recycling units for the toxics they produced, and they were scrapped too, like grist, or thrown away. That's all to say, this is a really fun book. No, it's not a fun. It is funny though. I mean, because it is about a town, and it's about people, and it's also about me going back to a place that I once loved, and reckoning with what that means when I discovered these things about it as an older person, and sort of how we interface with home. And yeah, just interrogating what it all means and trying to figure out the relationship of it.
So I asked you this before we started, and I threatened that I was going to ask it first, and I'm going to, is that now that you've written the book and uncovered all these horrible things about the legacy of what your community has leaned on for generations, are you now the town pariah?
I am not. It's weird.
You're not working hard enough.
People have been so incredibly supportive, and it doesn't surprise me, because the people in this town, after all that's said and done, are really genuine and honest and loving and loyal people. I mean, people I grew up with are still there. My mother was there and father during most of it while I was writing the book. And I go there, and of course I no longer live there. Really haven't lived there since I was 18, and I'm 53 now. So, but I never really feel like an outsider in that way. I feel very comfortable. I mean, there are places, as you see in the book, that I do feel discomfort because I am an outsider. I don't really feel acutely what they feel anymore. I'm from the working class, but I'm a writer. I don't even know what class that is. It's a working class, but a different kind anyway. Yeah, people have been supportive, and the most feedback I've gotten has been like, I'm really glad you wrote about this, or it's about time somebody wrote about this. And that was really surprising to hear. I thought, I knew people would be supportive because they genuinely do that, but to have people sort of cheer that part of it on felt really, I haven't heard anything negative from people in my town. Maybe they're just not saying anything. That could be, but I haven't had an event there either yet. The internet there is not reliable. A lot of people don't have computers. It's a very poor town. And so I'm waiting until I can get there and do an event in person. And then we'll know. And then I'll answer that question more thoroughly if anybody,
right.
if like people start throwing rotten fruit at me or something.
Right. Leif, what do you want to hammer with here?
Well, yeah, the book is really great. It is actually funny in parts of it. I laughed out
Thank
loud.
you. Yes, it was.
And it's really compelling read, but not in the way that like a lot of these stories are, like a civil action or whatever the.
Oh, I want to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, or what was the one that came out just about the DuPont case?
Oh yeah, yeah.
But all these books and movies, it's like a strange illness in town, and there's a shady company, and a protagonist like digs into the boxes and finds a smoking gun, and your story is not like that, But in a lot of ways, I think it's more satisfying than those books are. But I was just interested to hear, like,
yes,
for you to talk about a little bit about that different kind of narrative arc that you have in your book.
I'm so glad you asked that because nobody ever asked that. So thank you. It's telling a story about a toxic disaster that is basically invisible and slow and ambiguous in nature, pretty much out of sight and out of the news, and something that's attritional, like the dioxin that was produced by bleaching paper is attritional, meaning that as it goes up through your bloodstream, it gets stronger. So like, it's not really what we think of disaster, like you were talking about, like it doesn't have a central sort of fulcrum, or it doesn't have a disaster where something happens and then I have to go like, I'm like Erin Brockovich, although I adore Erin Brockovich. I hope she's not here. I don't mean any harm. That was a great story, actually. But that's not this story because, and so I thought about that as I was writing it, and like how to write that kind of story, how to write that kind of environmental story specifically. I thought a lot about it because there are a lot of environmental disasters like this. I mean, just across the US, think about whatever, fracking or just things that take sort of a long, and you can't find point A leads to point Z, right? So I couldn't write a story that went from point A. So it went like this, as I was saying. This is the structure of the book, and this is the shape of the river that I grew up on too. So I know that's probably a trope that a lot of people use, is like write a story like a river, but it was so fitting because it really was I went through this. You follow, for those who haven't read it, you follow me along in the research and trying to uncover what's going on. So it's really a book about me writing the book in a weird way that I thought about only later. So the same kind of sort of attrition that I'm finding in the DNA and in the chemicals was also mirrored in the way I was like compiling the information I was finding. So I used that also to tell that slow attritional story. Does that make sense? Am I making any sense? I don't even know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I've been thinking a lot about just environmental storytelling in general and how to tell stories, because, I am a book critic and editor at Orion, and I get, hundreds of books a month, and a lot of them are the same. And so they don't stand out. And how do you get those stories to stand out unless they're like Erin Brockovich or Robert Bellot's story? I can't remember. What's the name of that?
Yeah.
God, that's making me crazy. Somebody say it. Something water. Like I just reviewed this book called Standpipe by David Hardin, published by Belt Publishing. He was a volunteer water deliverer in Flint. And that was an interesting kind of story to tell. It's not just the same thing about Flint and all this, dreadful stuff that's happening. It was him delivering water. And so through that sort of focus, I thought was another interesting way to tell environmental stories. So it's something I'm thinking about a lot. So I'm glad you asked.
The problem with so many like the environmental disaster stories it's one thing if a reactor melts down and all of a sudden this whole community is being immediately evacuated, and it's this huge, action movie end of level boss finale, but so many of them, the whole process is slow. The sickness is slow. The people being ground into meat is slow. And we don't really like slow, we're not interested in slow.
Right. Yes.
So it's like when it comes to especially climate change, there's so many things with all the stats and the dates and I think people's eyes roll up in their head. And when you humanize it by focusing it on a family and the effects that it has had, generational, or the water deliverer, that type of thing. I think with the story, it's almost like the disaster has to be almost a subtext to the story of this human story that can grab our attention. And I think that's where you succeed and other people maybe fail, is because it becomes too much like a dissertation and not
polemic or something. Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
were you cognizant of that while you were writing it?
I really was. I thank you for calling it successful. And that wasn't what I was saying. I was like, I'm writing the story that nobody else can write. I wasn't really saying that, but it's something I really was thinking about, because I don't know if either of you have read Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor. It's a really incredible text. It's a literary critique. And I read that a while ago. And so I was writing it. It calls it slow violence, this kind of attritional violence, and he looks at these things as violences, not just disasters, and how he kind of goes through it and tries and just kind of like pokes at how to tell this story. And I really did think about that. And I'm so glad that you think about that too, because I feel not alone anymore in that.
Villains get away, like the mill here, while my dad worked there were 4 different owners.
What kind of mill was it? Sorry.
It started at a Horner Waldorf plant.
Okay.
And then it was Champion, and then it was Stone Container, and then they merged with Smurfit and became Smurfit Stone. And now whoever owns it now that is dealing with all the fallout, I mean, it's a super fun site. It just hasn't gotten the official designation because they've managed to stiff arm it at every turn. But it's a super fun site. And the people who are most responsible, probably you go back to Horner Waldorf, probably in Champion, is when like the worst, and Leif, you probably know this better than I do, as far as the worst environmental shit that was happening were in those early days. Because ours, what was like 58 or something like that is when it was founded, is when it was built.
Oh, yeah. Really?
Yeah. It was a paper mill, a craft paper mill. So very similar.
So same. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. No, you go.
Yeah, they came in and they were like, there won't be any pollution. And like within a year, there was a massive fish kill in the Clark Fork.
Of course. I don't, it's something you just said too, Chris, and then I want to get back to what you just said about fish too. The environmental storytelling, I think you're right on when the heart of a story is really the heart. You have to get to a heart. It has to be, and it's not just like you use a person to like quickly tell a story. I think the story's about the person, and all that, like you said, comes from it. You start with a human being and outspins everything from that. In a person, as we were talking about before, or Leif and I were talking, one person can spin out to tell a universe, and it has to be human. I mean, I get so many natural histories and stories about fish and everything. And it's like, I care about fish, but like, it's, I need to feel like some kind of love, really. Like, it's really hard to love a fish in the same way as you love a human, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's funny you say that, because that was actually one of the mill here at Frenchtown, the first kind of activism around it was like sportsmen who were concerned about the fish.
Which is great.
Women's groups emerged in the 60s. They were like, what about all the air pollution that's harming children in this area and stuff? And they were explicitly critical of that sort of focus on the fish kind of approach.
God, that could be an interesting essay. It's like the sportsmen, the fish, and the women with the air pollution. I bet there's like, I bet you could go through history and find like groups everywhere, like same groups focused on the same issues everywhere. It's true. And I thought about that too. In one chapter in the book, there are, they spent a lot of time testing the fish. And as I was researching, I'm like, God damn it, why don't they test the people? Like they never did that. It was always like, let's test and see how much toxicity is in this fish. And I know it's an indicator species, and I understand what that means, but at the same time, it's like, what about the people? There's still
Your class recently did that study, and they posted a bunch of photos from like the 70s, right? Wasn't it the 70s where the air pollution was so bad? And the funny thing is that I can remember smelling it. I don't remember the air pollution being that bad growing up. I mean, it looked like on a regular day, like it does here when we have fires in the area and the smoke is that bad. I have these memories associated with the smell, like my dad opening his lunchbox and smelling.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah, exactly.
All of his stuff. And now, however long it's been, 30 years, 40 years later, that's what I remember. I don't remember just the fog and filth in the air.
Do you still have his lunchbox?
I don't.
Yeah, because I smelled somebody's lunchbox. I know that sounds weird to everybody, but lunchboxes were like kind of a big thing. Everybody, right? I remember smelling one, and it like totally smelled like my father. Like I remember that smell so distinctly. It was like dead air. I don't know how to explain it. It's hard to explain smell, really. But yeah, it was.
It certainly had a very specific odor, just for sure.
Odor. I like the French accent on that one.
Uh-huh.
Speaking of French, so that's another. We were talking about the invisibility and sort of the slow kind of disaster, and that was the other. As I began this book, I was investigating really first genealogy, and then it became parallel. I was investigating environmental disaster, but the two things really parallel each other in that same kind of invisibility, because my family came from Acadia and French Canada, and the things that I found out about my family history, I hadn't known either, like the ethnic cleansing of Acadians in 1755 from the maritime provinces, and how they were basically like killed and run out of the country because they were like Catholic and French, shoved into corners of their own land, and to sort of look at that history and then sort of pull it forward to the current day. I should tell everybody, a lot of those people, long story short, ended up in my hometown. It's a very Acadian and French Canadian based town, a lot of them. And so to take that history and pull it forward too was part of that, looking at that invisibility or silent voices and things that people didn't say or talk about or even know, like me as a kid. I didn't even know like part of that. So I don't know what I'm saying about that. Oh, well, it was interesting too to relate it to the mill. Like New England and Acadians themselves were really the backbone of the Industrial Revolution, which I found out, like, it was such a huge percentage of Acadians that came during the Industrial Revolution from, like, I can't remember the number because I have a bad memory, as I was saying, but it was a lot from 1860 to like 10 or 20. A lot. They basically built the mills up and down the East Coast and worked at them.
Well, aren't the Acadians now the Cajuns in Louisiana?
It's a different crowd, actually. So those people, they didn't go directly there from the ethnic cleanse. They weren't. They. I think that a lot of them went to France first, or they went to different, maybe some islands, and then came up. So they weren't direct from the cleansing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was another history. Like, it was sort of, this book was a little bit of correction too to some histories. Like,
sure.
I take that, I don't really get into the Louisiana thing, but I just present what really happened and where all those people came. like a correction to that. And, Anne of Green Gables, and like, that's what everybody thinks about when they think about Prince Edward Island. But
well, yeah, I thought that history of Acadians was really fascinating. And I think, like, I do a lot of research in environmental justice, and it tends to be focused a lot on race or on class. But this was an interesting story more about ethnicity. I mean, it's also about class too, obviously, and maybe even race to some extent in terms of how Acadians were initially seen. But this really interesting story of ethnic group that was disproportionately exposed to these toxic chemicals and stuff as a result of their work and their communities. And also your discussion, which I wanted you to expound on a little bit, about like how to get back a little bit to like the history of groups that have opposed or fought aspects of pollution.
yeah.
Not a big part of the story you tell, and part of that has to do with ethnicity, at least from what I gathered from your book there.
I think so. I mean, it's not a big jump to say that, Acadians were French Catholic. They were brought up to be loyal and subservient to God or whatever, and hardworking. All the things you would want in a blue collar worker, right? Like really they were, and sort of practical. I mean, I'm very much all of those things myself. I wouldn't say subservient. Well, maybe, I don't know. But like, I can see those lines very distinctly drawn from me to those ancestors. And so what happened when they came to work in the mills, they sort of were like, they put their nose down, they worked. And they really weren't interested in being management. They just kind of wanted to do their sort of more independent thing, because that's what they had done in Prince Edward Island since like 1602 or something. I mean, they were there for a long time, and they had a culture very distinct that they built from France, which I also found really interesting. Like even their language is very different. So they brought those elements, I think, with them, and they were exploited by mill owners and mill managers. And it's not to say that they were necessarily, it's a complicated thing. It's not to say that, these are victims and they were exploited. But then I sort of go into that too, is like, did they have a choice? Was the American dream really an American dream? And if so, who was it really for? I mean, at the beginning of the century, systemically, like everybody rose because just things got better. They had clean water, and like everybody's life improved in a way. But then, once sort of that settled out for a minute, then it's sort of the division of class started happening, and it's just been getting further and further apart since. It really, I mean, if you ask me, which nobody's asking, but I'll say, I don't know if there wasn't any American dream. Everybody would, some people would argue, well, they came from a different country and look what they do. I went to college and I got an education and I'm doing better than they did in that way. But that's also but they were getting poisoned while they did it. And also, I would also argue that getting an education doesn't have to be the sign of success. I think that is part of the problem in our country, is that we see that as success. So inherent in that is an insult to people who don't get an education, like the working class. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, when are we going to start valuing that? So when people say, "Oh, you got an education," is that better? Like, who's deciding that that's even better? Anyway, well, it's better because I'm not working in a mill and getting poisoned, sure. But it just sort of, theoretically, I think America needs to start thinking about that, especially with the working class of America and manufacturing being gutted. What are we going to do with these people who are loyal and good working and et cetera, all the things I said? Like, is there a place for them in this society? And if you look at the way the last presidential election went, no, there is no place for them. They were pissed.
Well, it's interesting, tracing industry and like in certain areas. And when you start thinking kind of what you brought up as far as learning your family history and the Acadians, it is who was the workforce, so whether we're talking about Butte and the copper mining there, or, there were a lot of my people from Hill 57 that were in Great Falls that were working in a smelter in Black Eagle. And I kind of used that same trope. I don't know if I'd call it a trope, but at least path to, my dad just being the next generation of like Métis people, which I am, who in this valley found work here, whether they were trappers and guides, which we were all over the valley doing that. And then even like, it's the Frenchtown Mill, and I grew up in Frenchtown, and we were always told that it was because French people lived there. But the reality is it was a Métis town that scattered all over. My kind of mentor, Nicholas Ruman, called it the Métis archipelago, where our people scattered all these different little towns and created new towns based on where they came from. So like Frenchtown, there's a old book that has a census from 1860, and it lists all the people and by race, and there's 2 white guys, 1 Indian, and the rest are all listed as half-breed. And, growing up.
Wow, interesting.
All these family names that are connected to back when like Chicago and Green Bay were Métis trading posts are all family names that were people I grew up with. So like we were all connected and we had no idea. We had no idea that we were kind of sprang from the same kind of place.
Are you connected now to people?
A little bit. I mean, we're talking about your book, not mine, but that's kind of the story of it is tracking that down, and I think you could do that in any community. It's particularly where there's any kind of industry or extractive industry. I was talking to someone up in the Swan Valley, and there was question as to, how much indigenous input do they need for things that they're doing? Is there proof that they're even there? And from my point, it's like as long as there were furry animals there up until about 1840, I know we were there. It's just the record keeping is different for among
wow
people, and just all of it. It's there's some things you almost have to take on. If it's smoky and hot, it's probably a fire.
That's, that whole aspect of record keeping too. I don't know if you remember that about the book, but that's something too that I made corrections. This whole book started with obituary and my grandfather's death certificate that I was like, oh, I didn't know any of that. And then I started following the lines of it and found out most of it was wrong, you know? So the record keeping of, then I was like, well, what is real? Like, what is the fact? So then I'm like, I'm going to go to France. I'm going to go to Prince Edward Island. I'm going to go to the Maine DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection. I'm like going to try to find like what the truth is, and come to find out that's about as evasive as everything.
Right.
I mean, yeah, if the basic records like death and birth are wrong, like everything in between is messed up, and that's part of, I think, it's a huge part of the problem. I mean, not just record keeping, but like what that whole idea between, everybody's war on the truth here, and maybe it has something to do with the papers that they're filing away. I don't know. Have you ever experienced that in your research? Either of you, like just finding stuff that was just wrong?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I thought about, like uncertainty is such a underlying theme of your book, and I think it's really, it's just interesting, to get back to a little bit like we were talking about with activism and that sort of thing. Here in Missoula, the activists that emerged were white middle-class women who were educated, who were stay-at-home moms, and they had a lot of resources and time to invest in it. And that's just like, you worked on this for what, 10 years? It's like, very difficult. Like it's not better for people to have like higher education or whatever, but it makes them more vulnerable to these sorts of things. It's just an incredibly complicated, like it really is a serious barrier to like democratic involvement in like policies.
It is. That's such a good point. And I thought about that too when I was specifically in a chapter I was talking about food insecurity, where like 4 to 5 kids in our town now are food insecure. But, she was like, there were so many people like, oh, the government shouldn't be feeding these people. Shame on the parents. And I'm like, these parents, there's no work. And if they have to work, they have to go 20 miles out of town. And what if they don't have a car because they don't have any money? There's certainly no bus service. I don't know about probably in the wilds of Montana, there's not a lot of bus service either, right? And so never mind getting to that pretend job that's 20 miles away. And like, what if they don't even have a stove? I mean, there's just so many layers of like complications for people feeding their children. It was just like that whole idea about being, my point is, how are you going to be an activist when you like can't even cook a meal or but I think that was another thing I wanted to try to do with the book. And I think, Chris, your first question, it goes back to that, was I want to write a book about people that I grew up with, and then they'll read that book so they don't have to do all the work. Here, I did the work for you. I read a book about people like you and me and working class people. And they're my main audience. I want them to read it. Like, sure, I would love if policymakers read it and said, let's do something or whatever. But like, really, this is for those people so that they don't have to do the footwork and that they can be at least more aware. I mean, this isn't a book that says, go do something, but it's like, here's some information.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah.
Well, for one, back to Montana, I'm pretty sure our new governor believes Jesus rode a velociraptor to work every day. That's kind of the state of things in Montana right now. I mean, no joke. I mean, he's like a creative, what do you call him? Creationist museum financer or something like that. But one question I have, like the rabbit holes of research that you fall down. I mean, there are times I'll go to look one thing up and like 2 hours later, I've got a ton of information that I know I'm not going to use because of who I'm writing the book for. I'm not, the high level kind of, really detailed dates and names and academic type stuff has already been written. And I'm trying to write it for people who don't know their story. Right. Like when my first book came out and I would do events and talk about being Little Shell, and people who've lived in Montana their whole life would say, well, who I've never heard of the Little Shell. And I'm like, it was so frustrating. We've been here forever, And so, yeah, I mean, I get that idea of trying to write for your audience and tell them stories that maybe they didn't hear. But did you struggle with God, this is such great information, but it just really is too much?
Footnotes. No, but really it was really hard. I wanted to include because everything felt so important, like I have barrels of documents so what I did was sort of like vegetarian cooking, right? Like I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not a vegetarian, but pretend you are for a second. Right. So you have all these carrots and potatoes and you're like peeling everything and you have this pile. After you're done, you have this pile of peelings here and then the vegetables are here. So like all the peelings, I went through all the peeling, I peeled everything. I guess is to say that I had to read a lot to get down to trying to write a story that doesn't have all that in it. And like sometimes, I mean, that's why it took so long, and to put details in it with dates and all this stuff that I felt like, I felt like a reporter sometimes, but then I would put it in and I would just basically strip it out. I would suggest if you're writing that, put it in there and then just later footnote it, like, because at least it's there so you can refer to it and think about it as you're telling your story, but then I would just move it or, and my readers were like, a lot of people would just kind of get a little sleepy when they would read that. So I did a lot of things in bullet points so that you could either read them or you could skip them. Some of those data points that I thought were important, like all the crazy things that were happening in the 1980s around dioxin, which is the sort of main toxic in my book. What was I going to say?
Well, I have another question about
Yeah.
your sort of historical process. Like, I often think, there are benefits and drawbacks to being like an insider or an outsider to some subject. Things that you have blind spots and you see things from either perspective, I think. And you're kind of both in this book. But I was just curious if there was aspects that you felt like you either had a really good perspective on, or things that you found like, or worried you had blind spots about, or found out later you had blind spots about while you're writing it, kind of.
Yeah, I think that was also part of the structure. Well, that was actually the plot of the book, weirdly, was me leaving home and coming back. That was literally the plot. Everybody, big giveaway. It's going and coming and going and coming. But that sort of recursiveness is a departure and a return, right? So every time I would come home, I would touch upon again, like what home means. And sort of at the same time, I would be, I would ask a new question to myself or think about things in a new way. Like, what does it mean to come from this place that doesn't love you back? What does it mean to consider yourself part of the working class when you don't even have a job? Or like, what does it mean to leave a place and then return a place that has defined you? So it was like that actual movement between the proximity and the distance underlined how I was this insider and outsider, right? But it also I also felt like, because I have 30 photographs in the book, like I was a witness and a participant to the crime too, because not just in photography, but like I had been complicit. We're all complicit in a lot of ways to these kind of crimes, let's just say. And I was a critic and an advocate. So I felt like I was on the edge of a lot of those things all the time. And I think the one thing where it sort of the one time it came to a head is when I got involved intimately with started a water activist group in town. So this is not straight journalism, people. I was like, I'm involved. And, it's a fantasy to say any journalist or any writer, it's a fantasy to say you're not involved. I mean, not to say that I didn't tell the truth, but there's a desire to tell a different story or another kind of truth, which was really what I was driving at. It was like, okay, I can't find the truth in the papers. I can't link dioxin to cancer. I can't do this or I can't do that. So what's the other truth that I can find? What does that mean? So becoming an activist in my town was good for a little while, and then it wasn't so good because the thing that I realized was that I'm not feeling as acutely what they are feeling. I'd go home to my nice house in Connecticut, and they're there like with poverty all around and with water, Nestle coming in to take their water supply. Basically, is what I should tell everybody what was happening. It was really hard for me. They basically, I should tell people, they booted me out of my own group that I started. They were like, yeah, we don't need you anymore. And I was like, what? I was really upset. And sometimes once in a while I still get like mad, but then I'm like, well, it's not really my thing. It's just like, I wouldn't go back to this town and say, here's what you should do. People always ask me that, like, what would you do to fix the town? I'm like, I don't know. I wrote this book. It's your turn. Like, you do. It's not my problem. I mean, it is and it isn't, but it's the book was really to reveal, not prescribe, I think.
Well, I mean, I know, like, sometimes there's a level of hypocrisy that I live with, being,
Sure.
So angry at industry and the scars that they leave behind on the land and the people. And at the same time, I had a pretty damn good life because my dad was working at the mill. We were working class and we didn't have a lot of money, but we didn't go hungry. I always had some smoky hoopty to drive when I was in high school. I wasn't, the rich kid driving a Mustang, but my 64 Ford got us around, stuff like that. And we're lucky now that, the mill is gone. So I don't really even know anybody who's left that worked there. It's been 11 years, I think, since it's shut down. So I don't worry about that finger pointing hypocrisy. Like maybe if it was still cranking away because, I can remember people, the whatever environmental organization it was unfurling these big banners off the big catwalk thing that went across, and my dad, oh, those goddamn environmentalists, and rah, rah, rah. And by then I was already like, well, they,
yeah, you're like, but
you know?
but it's not hypocrisy. I mean, that's the one thing about, I feel like our society is weird. Like we can hold two things together. Like I can want the mill to succeed while criticizing it. Like we can do both. Like we can want progress. Like I'm sure you do. I would consider us probably environmentalists to some degree. I don't know. I guess we care about the environment. That's basically my definition of it. But we can still want progress, and we still have computers, and we still we all carry that sort of complicity or hypocrisy or whatever with us, and we can hold it. It's just I think the thing that I would like people to look at, I know you guys do, is like, what do we value about that? Like what's more valuable, like life or death? Maybe make decisions on that kind of shit than like tax dollars and blah 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 or something. Sure, tax dollars, but be creative leaders. And so I feel like this book, the only thing it can do like that is to educate people enough or to open their eyes enough to choose better leaders that will do better things for them in that way. So you don't end up voting for Velociraptors people or like that lady in Georgia or whatever.
Right.
I mean, I'm sorry, but we have to deal with reality here. I don't know.
So I have a question that's a little bit along the same lines, but I just got done working on this podcast about Butte, which is a mining town that my dad is from. It has a lot of similarities, a lot of environmental issues, and then a dying industry. And part of that we talked to a journalist who's from Butte, and she was mentioning that now what they often do with these big mining sites is the workers don't live around the mine anymore. They bring them there. And so you don't develop a mining town with all the problems with it, but you wouldn't have had Butte, which is an amazing place.
Huh.
That made me think about because there's a lot of things that these places produce besides just the actual products like paper and copper and stuff.
Right.
That are in some ways rooted in that hardship that's from them. And that made, I don't know, that's probably an unfair question to put in, but it was something that made me stop and think for a minute.
No, it's interesting. I'm not sure what your question is, but I'm thinking about, I mean, what are you asking exactly?
Well, I guess
of me
is how could things have been different, and would we want them to be so different that you wouldn't have had a Milltown?
Oh, right. Yeah, I don't know. I'm with Chris too. I had a wonderful childhood. Maybe his isn't wonderful. I don't know if he used that word, but I did. I have zero complaints about my childhood, except maybe I didn't get the new basketball sneakers every year like everybody did. But we didn't go without. My father, put 4 to 5 of us through college on his mill worker salary. And for most of those years, my mother didn't work. Only in the 80s, when things started to go south for the working class, did she go back to work. They certainly sacrificed, but we weren't eating canned beans every night. I mean, maybe we were, I don't know, looking back, that's another thing. It's that whole kind of back to your question too, is what was it? You go back to a place and you remember what it was like, but then you're like, was it really like that? Or do I want it to be a certain way? Or do I just remember these things in one way or another? How was it really? It's really hard to say. And then you look at pictures, which is another way, which is why I'm really interested in photography and history, and looking at, I stare at them and try to there's a bunch of photos on my website, my family photos, and I look at that, I'm like, God, our house looks kind of dumpy or something. Not dumpy. My mother would kill me. She was as clean as a pin. But I don't know. It just doesn't look very, but we didn't know. Who cares? We had I don't know. It was a great childhood.
That whole thing of bringing in workers from somewhere else, though,
It's so weird.
I
Yeah.
have a visceral negative reaction to that. I mean, because that's
Like another resource.
man camps on the Bakken, that's man camps that were fur trading posts. You bring people in and they just rip the hell out of it, and the people who are already there, and they leave and they don't care about it. So, it's almost like that's industry's response to say, we don't want communities to grow up around, you don't want the company town either, but at the same time, people who live somewhere and work there are invested in,
Right.
making it a nice place to live. And I feel like we had that here. Maybe I'm just naive and I'm just remembering seeing it all through rose-colored glasses, but as long as you had a gas mask to go outside with, everything was fine.
I know we were being poisoned, but I had a great childhood.
Right,
That's the conundrum, right? We were like but no, you're right. People, if you're bringing in people, there's no investment. And it's like, maybe that's part of the trick too, is like, well, they're not going to unionize, or they're not going to, fight back, and nobody's going to start an activist group. They're just going to go in and do their job and leave. That's like really sad. That makes me really sad. And and they're like, who cares who the town leaders are? There's nobody cares about anything. That sounds like something that happened in like a Mad Max film or something. Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? That's terrible. There's a question on the board.
I guess it's about time for that, isn't it?
I mean, we don't have to. I just saw it. It popped up into my head, and you guys can jump in too. This is from Jacqueline Brennan, where it's 2:42 a.m. It says, I'm curious if Kerri has come across situations where some of that shoddy record keeping she alluded to, especially around causes of death for working class people, has been a barrier to redress. I'm thinking particularly about folks who die or contract long-term illness after exposure to toxins from long careers in extractive industry. Would love hearing anything she's learned or come across on the subject. I'm thinking particularly I'm not sure what the question. Could somebody help me figure out what the question is? Worrying past people.
Was the lack of record keeping a barrier to you really learning the truth, I guess, is if that's what I'm reading.
Yes. I mean, I looked at a lot of death records, especially as like a sort of obsessed genealogist. I look at them, and there's a whole chapter in my book, Jacqueline. I think it's called, I can't remember what it's called. It actually, I think it's published on LitHub as an excerpt, which you can find. It's about me looking at my father's death certificate. My father, who died in the middle of me writing this book, of cancer too. And it's looking at his death certificate, and they say, like, died of this as an underlying condition of this, as an underlying condition of that. They have like 4 underlying conditions, right? So it's like a joke, because what was the actual cause of the death? It's these layers again of like sort of invisibility of like, what did he actually die of? I mean, most people you read in the deck, they died of pneumonia, or they died of like sepsis, or they died of something, but not the actual thing. Like, he had cancer that he got from working in the paper mill. Is that on his death certificate? No, it's not. So like, that is a problem, because they just put the actual moment of death. They might put the underlying cause. They didn't even put, he had a triple bypass back in his 50s, I think, and that wasn't an underlying cause. Maybe it was. Why didn't they put that? There's a whole, anyway, it's a whole like kind of insane chapter near the end of the book where I start to really look at those records and the Maine Department of Environmental Protection records, because part of that problem too is the record keepers can unconsciously have an agenda too. I mean, this whole business about the Acadians too, there's no records. They could read and write. There are no records about what they saw. It all came through the eyes of the general or whoever he was that like killed them all. So like, what really happened is still kind of up for grabs a little bit. People triangulate, and that's what Leif was saying a little bit about, or we were talking about how to go home again, and you try to triangulate a shape of what you think things were based on records based on talking to people, based on, and this is how I did it, based on going to France, based on, so all these records, I went through and got different kinds of records other than just that evidence that is literally wants not to be found.
Like, we see that with COVID too.
Yeah.
Patient died of a heart attack because he had COVID.
Right. Right. So this is like,
what? So it still happens. It's still happening.
It's still happening. Yeah. Records are just one kind of unit of evidence. You know, I used to be a paralegal too, which I looked at it like that. It was like building a case, like, or one you would watch on like British mysteries or whatever, crime shows. But there's all sorts of evidence out there. It's just like, again, Leif said, who has time to do that when you're working 9 to 5 and trying to feed 5 kids, like my parents, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
And what evidence gets kind of elevated over others? I mean, this goes back to a little bit what you were talking about, Chris. I mean, with Indigenous history, where you have a strong oral tradition and it's been long dismissed in favor of, you know, white record keeping and that sort of thing.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Elevated is a good way to put it. You know, even in the town hall I went to look at, those were records, the Historical Society in my town. You know, everything in there is like laudatory about the mill's founder. I just wanted to find one sort of like shred of humanity about him, like said he, I don't know, something, but it was nothing. It was just all praise, praise. And there's like statues everywhere, you know, this, that. And that's another whole thing about the record keeping or the memorializing of these people that extract things from the earth, but we never memorialize the consequences of those extractions. And it's something I'm working on. Another project that I won a grant for with the Architect League of New York. I know that sounds weird, but there's going to be a piece coming out February 5th where I reimagine all the memorials in Rumford. And I give them new, different life to show really what we should be memorializing, or memorializing, to take that word out of its context, but meaning like paying attention to, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about that, because my dissertation was on lead poisoning, and that's how I kind of concluded it as well. There's all these memorials. There's the shot tower where they made lead shot and stuff, but you're
so proud of it, right? You're like, it killed so many people.
It's hard. You have to think, like, how do you, this invisible thing, mostly invisible, doesn't really smell like anything or taste like anything.
Oh, let's talk about that, because I'm kind of obsessed with memorials. As you probably, if you go through my book, you could like circle them all. There's a lot, like Paul Bunyan.
Yeah.
Like the biggest example of it is this giant. We have one of those giant. You probably have one in Montana too. Who knows? Giant Paul Bunyan. It was like with this big axe. You know, everybody's like, he's so cool. I'm like, what? Ed Muskie was from our town. Ed Muskie, who penned the Clean Air and Water Act. Where's his goddamn statue?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's amazing. Like the Paul Bunyan thing is such a perfect,
I know,
encapsulation of what memorialization has been. But
it's so amazing. He's like chopping down the trees, and there's Muskie. He's got like his memorial in our town. This is no joke. It's like a granite thing with like dates. It looks like a grave site. It's not where he's buried, but it's like he stands for life, actually. And then this guy with the axe, I don't know, it's all messed up. So I'm really kind of obsessed with that. But yeah, this woman friend of mine, and I did a map, a reimagining of the tourist sites in Rumford, Mexico. That's going to be published by the Architect League pretty soon. Online. It'll be online.
But it'll be an actual like tour you could take of the town.
It's an interactive map. I mean, it's, you know, she's a great graphic designer and art director. And so you click on it and expand. Yeah, it's a map and everything. And I would actually like to implement it in the town itself.
Mm-hmm.
But wait till you see what's in there. So
Cool.
I don't know.
That's really cool.
Yeah, we'll see. There's
Any
Charlotte.
other questions before we?
Yeah, there's one right here by Charlotte Freeman. It sounds like what you're talking about is a history of the consequences of capitalism, post-capitalist studies along lines. Answer, yes. I am. I mean, this town, 40, 50 years, the past 40, 50 years, especially, I sort of go through this town is a microcosm of what has happened to America, right? Industry, the rise of the working class, whatever, middle class, you go through the 70s, the oil crisis, the 80s, there's suddenly companies become people. Milton Friedman writes his treatise and everything changes and the Berlin Wall comes down. I mean, it's all kind of in this book, actually. And
don't forget, first you kill the natives, then you build your town and your industry.
Right.
That's the America. That's the America we forget about. First, you got to eradicate everybody who's there first.
But my family didn't do that. My family married them. And that's in my blood. They're in my blood. The Micmac in Acadia. And so they didn't do that. So I feel pretty good. I mean, not that side of the family anyway. The other side, that's another book. But true. The first they kill them off. And then they do all that. And it's really just a microcosm and it just subverts the idea of Maine. I think people think Maine is such a pristine spot. And I'm here to say it's not.
I'm back. I felt like that was a really good line to end on.
It's not.
It's not.
Maine is this really pristine spot. It's not. It's like a really weird bumper sticker that Maine.
I'm a terrible human being.
Yeah. I feel like that hour went by so fast. I can't believe it's 7:00. I guess I'll give the audience one more chance to throw a question into the Q&A.
I'm gonna also put my email up.
Oh yeah.
Against my better judgment, but I will if anybody has any questions. I will not read your manuscript. So that's about it. Some people send me that. So now I say, I will not read it. If you have any more questions or if you have information to give me, even better. And Leif, you and I will continue talking about our obsessive. And Chris, I think we should do this once a month talk. We have so much in common.
Thank you, Kerri, Leif, Chris, for being here with us tonight. And thanks to everyone watching and participating. Just a reminder, you can purchase Kerri's book, Milltown, from Fact and Fiction Books. I threw the link in the chat box for you. And remember to enter MBF at checkout so that 10% of your purchase will come back to us so that we can continue programming events like this one. You can also go to montanabookfestival.com. There you can purchase merchandise and you can also donate again so that we can continue events like this one. Again, Kerri, Leif, Chris, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Have a great night.
Thank you. I hate this part.
Yeah, it's a weird part too. It's an awkward part.
I'm gonna wait till everybody's gone. I'm gonna stay last. Wait till you're all done. I could just stay on. See, now is when we'd go out and get a beer or something.
Yeah.
When the paperback comes out, I'm leaving home and never coming back. So maybe I'll see you then. But yeah, let's keep talking about lead.
Yeah.
Is this you? Oh, bye. We have to go.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna stop recording now.